This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nix Lotus, and today we're concluding my Theros Beyond Death full set limited review by looking at the remaining cards, multicolored artifacts, and lands. We've looked at all the other cards in the set so far. You should be able to find the playlist that has all those videos in it in the description below. I'm of course also not going to be completely done talking about the format. I have an archetype guide coming out, an MTG top 10 on the biggest bombs, and I'll also be, drafting the format, and videos of that will be coming out as well. So in this video, we'll be looking at all these cards in the context of draft and sealed. All right, let's get started. First up, we have Acolyte of Affliction, who for 2 generic, a green and a black, is a 2/3 human cleric at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, then you may return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So every color pair has a signpost uncommon that really pushes you in a certain direction if you're playing those 2 colors in draft. The black-green signpost uncommon makes it clear that black-green is all about the graveyard. I always love creatures who can return stuff from my graveyard because they tend to net you a 2-for-1. Gravedigger is always pretty good and limited, and this is better, although it is harder to cast. It helps you mill your library a bit, something you want to do in this format anyway, but it also means that even if your graveyard is empty, you have a solid chance of being able to get a card back with this thanks to the milling. The stats obviously aren't great, but they are good enough that it can trade with stuff early, and that's always nice. I think I like this enough that I would first pick it in a considerable number of packs, honestly. I think I want to give it a B. Next up, we have Allure of the Unknown, which for 3 generic, a black and a green, is a rare sorcery, and it says reveal the top 6 cards of your library. An opponent exiles a non-land card from among them, then you put the rest into your hand. That opponent may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. This is an interesting one. 5 mana to draw 5 is insane, but the downside here is very real. Giving your opponent the best card from these 6 that you reveal and allowing them to cast it for free might be brutal. However, I think this is something that might actually have more legs in Limited than it does in Constructed. This is because Limited games tend to go longer and the average power level of cards in your deck is also lower. Sure, things start out with you giving your opponent a free card, but the chance that you get to reap the benefits of the other 5 is definitely there. Will there be times when you use this and your opponent gets your bomb utterly destroying you? Sure, but I think it will be more common that your opponent gets merely a good card out of the deal, and you get insane card advantage in the long run. You have to make sure you're in the right position when you cast this, as if you give them something good when you're already behind, and you probably tapped out to cast this, you're probably dead. So, all that said, I'm not saying this is an excellent card by any stretch, and I definitely think it is a card that it will be hard to judge before playing the format, but I do think it's playable, and sure, sometimes it will feel a bit like Russian roulette, but the upside is there. Still, I don't think I can go above a C on it. Next up, it's Ashiok, Nightmare Muse, which for 3 generic, a blue and a black, is a legendary Planeswalker Ashiok at Mythic Rare. They start at 5 loyalty. There's a +1 that says create a 2/3 blue and black Nightmare creature token with, whenever this creature attacks or blocks, each opponent exiles the top 2 cards of their library. There's a -3 that says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, then that player exiles a card from their hand. And there's a -7 that says you may cast up to 3 face-up cards your opponents own from exile without paying their mana costs. This is a very impressive Planeswalker. 5 for 5 loyalty is usually a good place to be, and Ashiok can immediately go up to 6 loyalty and make a 2/3 creature, which also happens to start exiling stuff from your opponent's library. That last part probably won't matter a ton, but in a format that has a graveyard theme, it could turn out to be pretty nice. So Ashiok Nightmare Muse can use the 2/3 to protect them, and also just start filling the board with them. Ashiok's -3 ability is quite good too, allowing you to bounce something and make your opponent discard a card from their hand is great, and it will be particularly spicy in situations where your opponent has no hand, because you're basically just exiling a card from the battlefield. Ashiok's ultimate is also the kind that can just end games, though it does require some setup with the other abilities. So Ashiok can add pretty nice creatures to the board, bounce problem permanents, and has a game-breaking ultimate. That makes Ashiok an absolute bomb. I think you first pick them every time you see this card, and if you see it, you try to splash it. I'm giving Ashiok Nightmare Muse an A. Next up, we have Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, which for 2 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/2 legendary creature, human advisor at rare. has Menace, and it says, when Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, enters the battlefield, target opponent looks at the top 3 cards of your library and separates them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile. Put one pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So at worst, this is a 4-mana 3/2 with Menace that draws you a card. Thing is, your opponent always has to make 2 piles, and that means one of them will always have 2 cards, and more often than not, it will be correct to grab the 2 cards. Atris will actually create a fun little battle of wits where your opponent tries to decide whether or not it is best to put the best card alone in one pile and the 2 lesser cards in the other pile, or they try to psych you out one way or another. But no matter what, Atris will net you 1 card and sometimes more, while also helping stock your graveyard. Sure, a 4-mana 3/2 with Menace isn't going to be surviving attacking a whole lot, but that's okay, since you'll usually still be able to get a 2-for-1. All of that makes Atris worth first picking, despite being multicolored, giving it a B. Next up, it's Bronze-Hide Lion, which for a green and a white is a 3/3 cat at rare. You can pay a green and a white to have it gain indestructible until end of turn, and when it dies, you return it to the battlefield. It's an aura enchantment with enchant creature you control, and you can pay a green and a white for enchanted creature to gain indestructible until end of turn, and Bronze-Hide Lion loses all other abilities. In other words, it's just an aura, not a creature. This is a powerful 2-drop that is a fun callback to Fleecemane Lion, while also being a fun reference to Greek mythology, where Hercules kills a lion and wears its pelt. Anyway, a 2-mana 3/3 is obviously amazing on the vanilla test, and this has the ability to be indestructible. And when it dies, one of your creatures gets to wear its pelt, which is pretty nice. All of that makes this an attractive first pick, though I do think I would probably take monocolored premium removal over it, which means it's a B-. Next up, it's Calix, Destiny's Hand, who for 2 generic, a green and a white, is a legendary Planeswalker Calix at Mythic Rare. It starts at 4 loyalty, has a +1 that says, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card from among them and put that card into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. He has a -3 that says, exile target creature or enchantment you don't control until target enchantment you control leaves the battlefield. And a -7 that says, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, Calix is a planeswalker that really loves enchantments, and lucky for him, he's in a set that really loves enchantments. If you can get a decent number of enchantments, he'll be pretty nice. His +1 will regularly draw you a card, and his -3 will let you kill anything that stands in your way. He doesn't have an ultimate that will be consistently game-breaking, but it isn't bad. Now, again, this set is loaded up with enchantments for sure, and you do need a bunch of them to make Calix work, but I don't think that'll be that hard, especially in green and white, so I don't think we have to give him a build-around grade. I think, you do in reality have to build around him a little bit, but if you have 6 or 7 enchantments in your deck, he'll still be pretty good. More than that is obviously better, and it also isn't all that far-fetched. The downside he has is he has no ability to protect himself. Sure, he can exile stuff, but it costs most of his loyalty when he comes down. He can't make creature tokens that protect him or anything like that. So I don't think he's a bomb of a planeswalker or anything, but he can definitely take over games and help you win sometimes. But he's also pretty vulnerable. I do think you first pick him in some weaker packs. I'm going to give him a B-. Next up, we have Dalakos, Crafter of Wonders, who for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 2/4 legendary creature Merfolk Artificer at rare. You can tap it to add 2 colorless mana, but you can only spend the mana to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts, and equipped creatures you control have flying and haste. This is an interesting inclusion in this set because this set does not have a lot of artifacts or equipment, and those are the things he helps you out with. There are only 11 artifacts, and only 9 of those are common or uncommon. There are also only 4 equipments, and only 3 of those are common or uncommon. So the ability will come up some, but you really can't build around Dalakos in any really effective way, and I don't recommend doing it because, as we'll see, a lot of the artifacts in this set are mediocre. The good news is he is a 3-mana 2/4, which is actually pretty decent on the vanilla test. Sure, he costs both blue and red, but if you're in a blue-red deck and you have even 1 artifact or 1 piece of equipment, he's going to be worth running because of his upside. He does have the problem of not being easy to build around at all, and he's multicolored, but he has an okay fail case, an upside that will be nice on occasion. I think he is held to just a straight-up C. In a set with more artifacts and especially equipment, he would be much higher. Next up, we have Devourer of Memory, which for a blue and a black is a 2/1 Nightmare at uncommon, and whenever 1 or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, Devourer of Memory gets +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. It also has an activated ability where you can pay a generic and a blue and a black to put the top card of your library into your graveyard. This is a really fun and powerful looking signpost uncommon. As a 2-mana 2/1, it doesn't do so well on the vanilla test, but this set is loaded up with self-mill cards, especially in blue and black, and that will make it a 3/2 unblockable on your turn a lot of the time, and sometimes it'll be even bigger, especially because it comes with a built-in way to start milling yourself, which is not a bad place to sink your mana in the later part of the game. The Devourer can represent some serious inevitability, and I'm definitely interested in that. This seems like a powerful enough signpost uncommon that it is going to be worth taking with the first pick in some weaker packs, since if you do manage to make it work, it will be one of the best cards in your entire deck. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dream Trawler, which for 2 generic, 2 white, and 2 blue is a 3/5 Sphinx at rare. It has flying and lifelink, and whenever you draw a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. When it attacks, you draw a card, and you can also discard a card, and when you do, it gains hexproof until end of turn and becomes tapped. This looks like a lot of fun. A 6-mana 3/5 with lifelink wouldn't be very good, especially with a challenging mana cost, but it would be kind of okay. But this is so much more than that. Because it gets +1/+0 when you draw a card, it will always be attacking as at least a 5/5 while also drawing you an extra card. So, yeah, this draws you extra cards, gains you life, and does tons of damage in the air. But what really pushes it over the top is the fact that you can give it hexproof by discarding a card, which means this thing is a big challenge to kill. Now, it does have to tap when you give it hexproof, meaning your opponents can plan on making it unable to attack or block with a removal spell, but that's still way better than the Trawler dying. This has a difficult mana cost, and that might be its only downside, but I think in a vacuum, this is probably the best bomb in the entire set. You should first pick it when you see it and even consider warping your draft around it. I'm giving it an A. Next up, we have Enigmatic Incarnation, which for 2 generic, a green, and a blue is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another enchantment. If you do, search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrifice enchantment's converted mana cost, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. I have a hard time believing that you will be able to make this work in Limited. It asks you to have both enchantments and creatures with the right mix of converted mana costs for it to be most effective, and that just won't happen the way you want it to most of the time in Limited. Sure, getting rid of enchantments like the Omens, which do very little once on the table, and converting them into creatures sounds nice, but there aren't a whole lot of other enchantments in this set you really want to be giving up for a creature with a converted mana cost that is 1 higher. This card was included in this set for constructed purposes, not limited, and I think it's an F. Next up, we have Utopia, the twice favored, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 2/2 legendary creature human wizard at uncommon, and it has Constellation. When an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and that creature gains flying until end of turn. The blue-green signpost uncommon makes it clear that this color pair is all about Constellation, and Utopia is a great payoff for enchantments. Making creatures permanently larger with a +1/+1 counter is always nice, but also giving that creature flying until end of turn is amazing, since it will often mean you get to attack with something that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Keep in mind too that even if you have nothing on the board, Utopia can pump herself. I think this is such a strong payoff that it is a signpost uncommon I want to go after with a first pick and certainly early in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Gallia of the Endless Dance, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 legendary creature satyr. At rare, she's got haste. Other satyrs you control get +1/+1 and have haste, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may discard a card at random. If you do, draw 2 cards. A 2-mana 2/2 with haste that might pump some of the creatures in your deck wouldn't be that exciting most of the time, but if your deck is aggressive, the ability to discard a random card and draw 2 is super powerful. It's the kind of thing that can keep a really aggressive deck from running out of steam, as they sometimes can. Note, by the way, that Gallia doesn't need to do the attacking herself for that effect to happen. It can be any 3 creatures, so you can keep her back so you can continue to get value out of that ability instead of her dying in combat. I also think there are enough satyrs at lower rarities in this set that Gallia will be pumping like 1 creature a decent chunk of the time, and that's some nice additional upside. I just think that the attack trigger here is so strong that I'm willing to take her with a first pick and give her a B. Next up, it's Hacktoes, the Unscarred, which for 2 red and 2 white is a 6/1 legendary creature human warrior at rare. He attacks each combat if able, and when he enters the battlefield, you choose 2, 3, or 4 at random. He has protection from each converted mana cost other than the chosen number. Achilles, I mean, Hacktoes seems really good, even if he is difficult to cast and only has 1 toughness. He's a 4-mana 6/1 that will be very difficult to take down in combat. This is because his random ability will usually make it challenging for creatures to block it, and sometimes, and frequently really, he'll just straight up be unblockable. Worth noting that, of course, he also blanks removal spells thanks to his random ability. Now, because he is random, there will be times where he isn't able to do anything, but it seems like most fail cases will still involve him being able to attack and trade with something. The mana cost is hard, but I think it's worth it. Worth it enough that I want to take this with the first pick in some packs when I see it. But be ready to give up on Hacktoes if red and white aren't both open, and his ability's randomness will sometimes be really frustrating when you're like, great, I drew Hacktoes, play Hacktoes, and the number you name is 2, and your opponent just has a bunch of 2-drops that they don't care about trading for it. That will happen, and that's the kind of thing that keeps him from being anything more than just a solid B, which is a good place to be, but he's definitely not a bomb, even though there will be games where he's just an unblockable, unkillable 4-mana 6/1. You have to realize that people are going to have a lot of 2, 3, and 4 mana cost things in their deck that can probably block him or kill him, so keep that in mind. Next up, we have Hero of the Nixborn, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 2/2 human soldier, enchantment creature at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human soldier creature token, and like all the heroes we've seen, he has a trigger that says, whenever you cast a spell that targets Hero of the Nixborn, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Here is our last Hero of the Week. Like the others, he doesn't have heroic, but basically does, capable of giving +1/+0 to your whole board. This guy's nice because he helps you go wide while also paying you off for going wide since he brings a token with him. Unlike most tokens in this set too, this one isn't a satyr and it can actually block. So yeah, this is going to be a very powerful card in red-white aggro decks, and I think it is actually just good enough that taking a risk on it early is probably worth it sometimes. He'll just be a very key card for red-white go-wide aggro decks, and you will never cut him from decks in that color combination, giving him a B-. Next up, we have Klothys, God of Destiny, which for 1 generic, a green and a red, is a 4/5 legendary enchantment creature god, indestructible, and as long as your devotion to red and green is less than 7, Klothys isn't a creature, and it has a triggered ability that says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a land card, add red or green, otherwise you gain 2 life and Klothys deals 2 damage to each opponent. Klothys does some very powerful things for a 3-drop. This set has lots of graveyard stuff going on, so both your graveyard and your opponents will often have things in it, and Klothys gives you some great value when that's the case, either ramping you or draining the opponent for 2. I also kind of like the 2-color gods, even though this is the only one we have, more in limited. Even though monocolored is pushed in this set, I think you'll end up in 2 colors more, and while the 2-colored gods asks you for more devotion, it is a big deal that every permanent in your deck will contribute to Klothys' devotion. Not something that you can always say with the monocolored gods, but yeah, the value it gives you as an enchantment already intrigues me, and becoming a huge indestructible creature later in the game is huge upside. I think Klothys is a bomb that's worth first picking, giving it an A-. It just seems like it's going to take over games where it's just exiling stuff from graveyards, killing your opponent, ramping you. It's going to be a lot of fun. Next up, we have Crocs, Titan of Death's Hunger, which for a black and a red is a 6/6 legendary creature, Elder Giant at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Also, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life, and it has Escape. For 2 black and 2 red, and you exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, you can cast it from your graveyard. I really like the design on both of the multicolored Titans because they seem somewhat familiar in what they do, like Titans we've seen before, but they're also pretty unique and do something that's pretty unique to the set with Escape. On the face of it, this is sort of like a black-red sorcery that makes your opponent discard something and they get punished for it if it's a land. If that's all this was, it wouldn't be that good, but honestly, that's the kind of discard spell that might be a little more interesting to actually see, because even in a fail case, you get to damage your opponent, so it's a discard spell that actually does something, unlike most of them when your opponent's hand is empty. However, Croxa does a lot more than that. The big thing is that he can escape, of course, come back, get the discard trigger again, and then do it every single time he attacks, which will be relatively often thanks to his size. He will quickly give you card advantage and do a bunch of damage if you can bring him back. Now, getting him back is no joke. 2 black and 2 red is not an easy cost by any means in limited, and you also have to have a fair bit of stuff in your graveyard. Luckily, the latter part shouldn't be too hard because of all the graveyard stuff in this format, but still. In the end, I do think Crocs manages to get a bomb grade, an A-. He can just take over games, and while he won't always just be popping out of the graveyard with ease, getting him back shouldn't be too hard. Next up, it's Kuno Rose, Hound of Theros, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/3 legendary creature hound at rare. It has Vigilance, Menace, and Lifelink. Creature cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast spells from graveyards. People often overrate this kind of card in Limited. A recent similar example was Questing Beast, a super efficient creature with a brick full of text, but one that isn't imposing enough to really be considered a bomb, since it can be blocked without a whole lot of effort. Now, don't get me wrong, Questing Beast was excellent, and you took it almost every time you saw it, but it was nowhere near a bomb, since Limited often has very cluttered board states, and it frequently just couldn't do a lot. Now, Kuno Rose does come with an evasive ability in Menace, as well as having Lifelink and Vigilance, and that's all pretty nice together, but he'll have the same problem. There will be board states where it just can't attack effectively. It does come with some useful hate abilities that will certainly come up in this format, but I still don't think it's a bomb, but I do think you take it with your first pick most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Mischievous Chimera, which for a blue and a red is a 2/2 enchantment creature chimera at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you scry 1. So the blue-red archetype, as this tells you, is all about casting things on your opponent's turn. And the good news is that seems to be really well supported. Earlier in the week when I talked about blue and red, you probably heard me say a lot, this gets some bonus points for having flash or being an instant. And because of that, I think the blue-red deck will sort of just come together pretty easily. And here you have a 2-mana 2/2 flyer. That's a pretty reasonable floor to have, and then it has a pretty powerful trigger. Doing 1 damage to your opponent the first time you cast a spell during their turn is nice, as is Scry 1, and the Scry 1 can help you sort of keep the gas coming, because you can be like, okay, this isn't an instant, I really need an instant, and you can put something on the bottom of your library because you really want to just keep being able to cast stuff on their turn while this Chimera attacks them in the sky, essentially doing 3 damage to them every turn. Like a lot of Signpost uncommons, I think this is one that in a weaker pack you'll first pick, so I think it's a B-. But with all of these sort of Signpost uncommons, for the most part, you should usually be taking a comparable monocolored card over them, just because they're going to make your deck in a higher percentage of drafts. Next, we have Pulu Chronos, Unchained, who for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 0/0 legendary zombie Hydra at Mythic Rare. He enters the battlefield with 6 +1/+1 counters, and it escapes with 12 +1/+1 counters. If damage would be dealt to Pulu Chronos while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage and remove that many +1/+1 counters from it. You can also pay 1 generic, a black and a green, and it fights another target creature. And of course, he has Escape, where you can pay 4 generic, a black and a green, exile 6 other cards from your graveyard, and that means you can cast them from your graveyard. Well, Pulu Chronos is back, and he is undead and super powerful. A 4-mana 6/6 is already at least a B, and while Pulu Chronos does have an ability that is mostly a downside, preventing damage and removing that many +1/+1 counters, he comes with enough additional upside that you shouldn't really care. His ability to fight anything means he can kill multiple creatures if he can stay in play, and he can escape later in the game and come back as a 12/12, which will allow him to fight a lot more things. Now, I do think he is held back from straight A+ status, because the +1/+1 counter damage prevention is mostly a downside. Him shrinking down is not exactly ideal for a fight effect, but he's still an A and one of the best bombs in the entire set. Next up, it's Rise to Glory, which for 3 generic, a black and a white, is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose one or both. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, return target aura card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I'm not a huge fan of this as far as the Signpost uncommons go, mostly because if you can only get 1/2 of this, it's pretty terrible. 5 mana to reanimate a creature or aura just isn't very good. You're not really gaining any sort of card advantage, and often you'll be spending more mana than your creature or aura is worth. So to really be doing it, you need to have both an aura and a creature a decent chunk of the time, and this set does have lots of auras and creatures, and it has a graveyard sub-theme, but I imagine the setup here will still be a little bit tricky sometimes, and sometimes you just won't be able to cast this. Sure, it can reanimate bombs and stuff, but we've seen lots of 5-mana reanimation spells in Limited over the years, and they are almost always unimpressive. Now, I don't think this is unplayable or anything. You probably always play it in black-white, assuming you have the auras and graveyard stuff you need, but as far as a Signpost uncommon goes, this isn't one that sort of pulls you into its color pair. It's one you take when it already looks like you're in black and white, and I think that means it's a C+. Next up, it's Iona, Captain of the Pyleas, which for 1 generic, a green and a white is a 2/2 legendary creature human soldier at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an aura card from among them and put it in your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a creature you control, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. This is another really powerful and fun-looking signpost uncommon. Iona makes it clear that green-white is all about enchantments, and more specifically, auras. It is going to be pretty hard to whiff entirely on auras in your top 7 cards in this format, so generally, Iona will at least be a 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a card, something that is always solid, but then it comes with the ability to make a creature token every time you put an aura on one of your creatures, and that's a nice payoff too. As you've heard me say throughout this set review, auras can sometimes be risky, because if your opponent has removal, you get 2 for 1, but making a creature token every time you put an aura on something helps soften the blow if that's what happens, because at least you have a 1/1 left behind. Iona is going to draw you a card and make 1 to 2 creature tokens without a whole lot of help. I think she does enough to be a first pickable signpost uncommon. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Slaughter Priest of Mogis, which for a black and a green is a 2/2 Minotaur Shaman at uncommon, and whenever you sacrifice a permanent, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. You can also pay 2 generic and sacrifice another creature or an enchantment, and it gains first strike until end of turn. This signpost uncommon makes it clear that black-red is all about sacrifice, and what I really like about it is that it's both a sacrifice payoff and a way to sacrifice stuff. The fact that the baseline here is a 2-mana 2/2 is nice, especially because this guy will be kind of a nightmare to block in a lot of scenarios, since he can easily become a 2-mana 4/2 with first strike, and even larger if need be. There is going to be a lot of opponents just taking 2 at a time from this out of fear of blocking it, but that's just fine for you, since you will just keep developing your board while the Slaughter Priest attacks. It also isn't bad defensively, by the way, since first strike is also sometimes hard to attack through. It's also good that he can sacrifice enchantments as well as creatures, so there will be a fair bit of fodder for it. Sacrifice archetypes in the past have been kind of disappointing, so even though I'm excited about this card, I don't think I want to give it a grade that means it's good to take early. Instead, I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Staggering Insight, which for a white and a blue is an uncommon aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. I love the idea of putting this on an evasive creature. This is another aura that's good because it helps you avoid getting 2 for 1, in this case because it draws you a card. As long as you draw 1 card with this, at worst you're going to get 2 for 2, and if you get to draw more cards than that with it, well, there's a good chance you win the game because you're just going to start running away with things while also gaining a bunch of life thanks to lifelink. Those 2 things combined are going to really snowball and make it hard for any opponent to beat you. And most blue-white decks are going to have a reasonable number of flyers, so there really will be times where you just stick this on a flyer and run away with the game. Putting it on creatures on the ground makes it harder to get the full value out of it, but it still represents a real threat. I really like this aura, and I imagine you play as many of them as you can in most blue-white decks in this format, and I think you even want to first pick it in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 6/6 legendary Elder Giant at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escaped, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and it has escape. You can pay 2 green and 2 blue to exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, at which point you can cast it from your graveyard. So, if it doesn't escape, you basically have a 3-mana spell that gains you 3 life, draws you a card, and puts a land onto the battlefield. How good would that card be? Probably a C- or a C. The fact that it doesn't add to the board in that situation is rough, but the life gain helps offset that a little bit, as it allows you to not feel too bad about the tempo hit. Then, when this escapes, it gets to be completely absurd, amounting to a 4-mana 6/6 that will then draw you a card, gain you 3 life, and let you play a land every time it attacks. So the question becomes, how easy will this be to escape with? Well, it does require double-colored mana and asks for 5 other cards in your graveyard, and both of those things are far from completely guaranteed. However, it does seem doable. I just don't think you should count on always being able to make it happen. I think in the end, Uro is a bomb because it really takes over the game if you escape with it, in addition to the fact that it has a reasonable baseline even if it can never escape. I'm giving it an A-. Our last multicolored card is Warden of the Chained, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 4/4 Minotaur Warrior at uncommon. It's got trample, and it can't attack unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater. This signpost uncommon might be the least impressive one. Sure, the guy is efficient and he has trample, but I feel like I should be getting a little something else to make up for the downside here. Sure, even if you don't have a big enough creature, the Warden is a good blocker, and red-green is the color pair all about having higher power, but still, just not that impressed here. Will you play him in all your red-green decks? Yes, but he shouldn't be the card that pulls you into the color pair. I'm giving him a C+. Right, now we move to artifacts, where our first one is Altar of the Pantheon, which for 3 generic is a common artifact. It says your devotion to each color and each combination of colors is increased by 1, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Then, if you control a god, a demigod, or a legendary enchantment, you gain 1 life. This is a neat design for a common. As we've seen a lot throughout this week, devotion is a theme in this set, so increasing your devotion to everything is a nice little effect, especially because it is attached to a mana rock that can produce mana of any color. You won't be gaining that 1 life a whole lot, but it is some nice additional upside. I think if you are in need of fixing and your deck also likes devotion a lot, playing one of these will feel fine. I do think, however, that it will be cut a decent amount of the time too, because you don't always need fixing or devotion enough to warrant playing this. I'm giving this a C-. Next, it's Bronze Sword, which is 1 generic mana for an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and it can equip for 3 generic mana. 1 mana to cast this is pretty nice, but 3 to equip is way too steep. It's a passable stats boost, but I don't imagine you end up playing this unless you end up with Dalekos or something. I'm giving it a D. Next we have Enchanting Lyre, which for 3 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You may choose not to untap it during your untap step, and you can pay X generic mana and tap it to tap target creature with power X or less. It doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as it remains tapped. This is an interesting one to evaluate. We all know that Icy Manipulator and its ilk tend to be really strong, and this is somewhat comparable to that. While it is going to be more expensive to tap stuff down, it can lock things down permanently, unlike the Manipulator. That effectively makes Enchanting Lyre a removal spell, but a pretty flexible one that can switch off and on to creatures, assuming you have the mana lying around to do it. Also important to note that for a turn at least, you can use this to get 2 blockers out of the way. You can do this if you have something tapped down of theirs, but then untap it on your turn and then use it again to tap down a new creature. The first creature you tapped will now untap, but it won't be until their untap phase. The mana requirements here might get to be a little bit high, and in the early game it will probably just be a hunk of metal on the battlefield, but its ability to lock down your opponent's best creature and allow you to get 2 blockers out of the way when you need to makes this card seem pretty good to me. I'm sort of struggling with whether I want to first pick this or not. It's kind of a weird card that I think I will need to play with to get a real feel for it, but for now, I think it is worth taking with a first pick in weaker packs. I'm going to say it's a B-. Next up, it's Mirror Shield, which for 2 generic mana is an equipment at uncommon. An equipped creature gets +0/+2 and has hexproof, and whenever a creature with Death Touch blocks or becomes blocked by this creature, destroy that creature, and you can equip it for 2 generic mana. I'm not usually a big fan of this type of equipment. Hexproof is pretty powerful, of course, but because it doesn't really make the creature that much better, apart from the hexproof, you have to have a creature that is worth putting this on. Hexproof makes your creature harder to kill, but it doesn't make it any better at attacking or blocking, though the +0/+2 and the Death Touch hating ability do, I suppose, marginally improve your creature's ability to attack or block. I think this is best to avoid in most cases, though I suppose if you have a few impressive win conditions, you might consider it, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Nix Lotus, which for 4 generic mana is a legendary artifact at rare. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it and choose a color. Add an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. This is interesting, but I think that most of the time you won't want to play this in Limited. This is because it's only good if you have 2 things going on. One of them is that you have stuff worth ramping into or mana sinks, and the other is that you are really heavy in one particular color. It is nice that you can choose between colors to maximize the mana it gives you, but mana ramp like this usually only has a very narrow uses in Limited. That said, if it turns out this format really does have enough mana sinks and things like that for this to be more useful, it'll be a little bit better than I'm thinking now, but for now I want to say it's a D+. Next we have Shadow Spear, which for 1 generic mana is a rare legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and lifelink. It also has an activated ability that says permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and it has an equip cost of 2. Now this is a good equipment. 1 mana to cast and 2 to equip is very efficient for the useful stats boost you get here. Lifelink makes it very hard for your opponent to race against your creature, and trample makes it so your creature can't really be chump blocked effectively. Turning off hexproof and indestructible will come up occasionally, but I think in evaluating this, we may as well leave it off the card because it won't come up enough to really take it into account. However, keep in mind, you don't actually have to have this equipped to anything to use that ability, so if it does come up, keep that in mind. However, between being colorless and being able to efficiently make any creature you control into a threat, this is something I think you want to first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Soul Guide Lantern, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you exile a card from a graveyard. You can tap it and sacrifice it to exile each opponent's graveyard, and you can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice it and draw a card. This is interesting. As we've seen throughout the week, there is a lot of graveyard stuff in this set. Soul Guide Lantern is one of the best ways to hate on your opponent's graveyard. The question is whether or not Soul Guide Lantern will be worth playing in your deck, and to get that answer, we probably need to play the set some. However, I can give you my initial impression. I don't think you should be playing this in your main 40 cards. There is enough graveyard hate in this set on cards that can actually do something other than hate on the graveyard that I don't think you need a card completely zeroed in on that effect. And sure, you can basically cycle this if you don't need it, and that's not a terrible fail case, but you're still running a card that will sometimes do nothing. That said, if you're playing best of 3, it's an excellent sideboard card for this format. I'm going to say for now, it's a D as a main board card and a C+ as a sideboard card. Depending on how things shake out, it could end up being a card you want to main board, but for now, my prediction is it won't be. Next up, we have Thaumaturge's Familiar, which for 3 generic is an artifact creature bird at common. It's a 1/3, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. Hate to say it about a bird, but this is pretty underwhelming, especially because this set cares very little about artifacts. This isn't unplayable or anything, but 3 mana for a 1/3 flyer is not impressive on the French vanilla test, and adding scry 1 to the mix doesn't help much. You'll play this when you're desperate for a creature or 3 drops, but you'll probably avoid it most of the time. I'm giving it a D. Next, it's Thundering Chariot, which for 4 generic mana is an artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's a 3/3, it has first strike, trample, and haste, and it crews for 1. This seems pretty solid to me. Only needing a crew of 1 is great, and means the tokens in this format can crew it. Then the keywords it has makes it very difficult to go into combat with. Look, imagine this were a 4 mana 3/3 with those keyword abilities that required you to tap a 1/1 every turn or can't attack or block. That'd be a pretty nice card, and that's basically what this is. Except it might just be a little better because by not always being a creature, it can dodge sorcery speed removal. I think any aggressive deck will feel fine about playing this. I'm going to start it at a C+. Next we have Traveler's Amulet, which for 1 generic mana is a common artifact. You can pay 1 and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. We've seen this a lot, and it's always nice to have it common because it gives every deck an easily accessible way to fix their mana. You could even consider cutting a land from your deck to run one of these, at least in decks with lower curves, and that always feels pretty nice. This is something you'll always play if you're splashing, and something you probably won't play if you aren't, but I think you should value it somewhat highly, even if you haven't already found something to splash, because it helps you keep your options open. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Wings of Hubris, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature has flying. You can sacrifice Wings of Hubris, and if you do, equipped creature can't be blocked this turn, but you sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step, and you can equip it for 1 generic mana. This seems kind of passable. It only costs 1 to equip, and flying is a pretty nice keyword ability on many board states. The fact you can sacrifice it to make a creature unblockable for a turn might provide you with some important reach too, but generally you won't be doing that unless your opponent is dead to the damage. I don't know. You probably still don't run this a ton. I think it is probably just a D+, but it could overperform. I could see that happening. That is our last artifact. Now we're moving into lands. Our first land is Field of Ruin, which is an uncommon land that you can tap to add colorless mana, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls. Then each player searches their library for a basic land card and puts it on the battlefield and then shuffles your library. This is unplayable and limited, as it often is. There aren't enough non-basics in this set for it to be worth running. If there were, it would actually be kind of interesting, since it can also fix for you, but if it doesn't have a target, it's just a land that produces only colorless mana, and that's a liability in limited, where mana bases usually aren't very good to begin with. That makes it an F. Next up, we have Labyrinth of Skophos, which is a rare land. You can tap it to add colorless mana, and you can pay 4 generic and tap it to remove target attacking or blocking creature from combat. I love good utility lands in Limited, and that's what we have here. While it will cause your mana base to be a little worse than it would be otherwise, since it only adds colorless mana, the effect the Labyrinth has is powerful enough that it's worth the downside. The ability to remove things from combat is huge, and you can use it to your advantage whether you were attacking or blocking. If you use it defensively, the effect gets pretty close to Icy Manipulator, where you just shut down a creature every turn. If you're the one who is the beatdown, the threat of activation of the Labyrinth can wreak havoc on any ideas your opponents might have of double blocking. The fact this just hangs around and produces mana when you need it to, and then has a very real impact on the game later on, makes this a nice land to have around. Also, don't forget there is a red uncommon Minotaur who loves this land because he'll fight anything you target with it. All of that stuff makes this worth first picking in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have the cycle of temples in this set. These are all lands that enter the battlefield tapped and scry 1 when they come into play, and then they all tap for 2 mana. There's one for blue-white, one for blue-black, one for red-green, one for red-black, and one for green-white. These are all great sources of fixing that improve your draw with that scry. I tend to value lands like this pretty highly. Enabling splashes is no joke, and making your mana base way better in a 2-color deck is nice too. You can take these over all the medium cards in the set and feel pretty good, which gives them a C+, like most cycles of rare dual-color lands. And our last card is Unknown Shores, a common land that taps for colorless mana, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. I don't know why they keep printing filter lands like this. They tend to be pretty bad, and players also tend to overrate them. Sure, it's a way to fix your mana, but it is highly inefficient, essentially costing you an extra mana to cast anything that has a color other than your primary ones, and effectively making you use 2 lands for only a single mana. Sometimes you'll run this out of desperation, but most of the time it is best avoided. I usually give this a D-, but because we keep seeing it, I'm going to give it the first ever D-. Only run this if you have absolutely no other choices for fixing. So, those are my thoughts on all of the multicolored, colorless, and land cards in this set. And of course, I've given you my thoughts as well on all the other cards in this set for the limited format. Again, if you're looking for the rest of those videos, there should be a link in the description below that takes you to the playlist. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not done yet either. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you the archetype guide where I talk about what each of these 2-color pairs will want to do in this format. I sort of alluded to a lot of it in this video when we saw the signpost uncommons, but I'll go a lot deeper tomorrow. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future Theros Beyond Death content, including this archetype guide and draft videos coming soon, don't forget to subscribe. And if you disagreed with anything in this video, that's what the comments are for. Thanks for watching.